My name is Steve Bankston. I'm with PricewaterhouseCoopers. I want to welcome you to our intimate event on forming and managing boards of directors. This is intentionally going to be an informal panel where we encourage you to ask questions early and often, because in most of the panels we've been today and other events, the audience Q&A is the best part. So if you have a question, get my attention and we'll get it to the panel. Otherwise, the format is going to be I'm going to introduce each of the panels, just kind of starting here and going down, and they're going to chat about the main thoughts they have on this topic, both from their perspective and from things you ought to know if you're in the position of creating or managing your own board or being a board member. And then I'll start asking questions once we finish the panel discussions until I see questions from the audience. And with that, Diane, I guess you get the favored position. With that, we'll start with Diane Savage from Cooley. I'm not going to go into their bios, and I've asked them not to go into their bios because they are in the booklet. If you have specific questions, feel free to ask them either in the panel or afterwards. Diane, you have the floor first.
Well, when I was asking Steve how this was going to be organized, he said, well, we're going to go, from right to left in terms of speakers. And I looked around, and the only seat left was this one. So the good news is Steve also told me not to be redundant, and that's not a problem for me. And, in any event, I tried to kind of organize my thoughts. I'm probably the least qualified person up here to be the first speaker. As a lawyer, and having been a lawyer in Silicon Valley for now, I can't believe it, 30 years, I have attended hundreds of board meetings, but I have not sat on a board. So I'll be looking at this from the point of view of somebody who has sat in a lot of good board meetings and a lot of bad board meetings. And my observations will come from the point of view and the perspective of an observer as opposed to a board participant in terms of a board member participant. And I really came up with kind of 7 points that I wanted to mention, and I'm sure that some of the other panelists may corroborate them and others may argue that what I've said isn't true at all from their perspective. First, the title of this was, as I understand it, Choose Your Bosses Wisely, Forming and Managing a Board of Directors. And when I was talking about this to some of my associates, of course, most of the companies that we work with are venture-backed companies, and there isn't a whole lot of selection involved in the process of a venture-backed board. Generally speaking, one thing that you need to be aware of course, and I'm sure you are, when you are seeking venture capital and the VC is doing due diligence on your business plan and on you as a prospective investment, you should be doing due diligence on that venture capitalist as a prospective board member, because that will be your board. Your venture capitalist will be the bulk of your board in the early stages of the company, and more than likely throughout the time that the company is privately held. If you are lucky enough to be in a position to do so, you will want to choose your venture capital investors based on the partners who will be sitting on your board. Different VCs will bring different industry experience, different perspectives, different management expertise to the table, and those are things that you should be thinking about as you consider which venture investor makes the most sense for you. And when the VC gives you a term sheet, and the term sheet will include, among other things, what they see as the constitution of the board, whether it's a 5-person board or a 3-person board, how many board seats the VCs get, how many board seats the founders of the company get. One of the things that you're going to want to do is, to the extent that you are very interested and motivated to have an individual that you've been working with on your board, you want to see that person's name in the term sheet, so that you don't wind up in a situation where you have an expectation and an understanding that one person's going to be sitting on your board and you find out after the financing that it's going to be someone else. The second point I want to make is, don't make the mistake of putting your lawyer on the board because you think you're going to be getting free advice from your lawyer. That frequently happens. In rare occasions, it may actually make sense to have a lawyer on your board of directors. But when that lawyer sits on your board, the lawyer is sitting on the board as a director and needs to be wearing his director's hat and is not there to be representing the corporation as its lawyer. In fact, in those situations where a Cooley lawyer sits on the board of directors of a company, we will send another lawyer to the board meeting to act as the lawyer and to be sitting there thinking as the lawyer as that board meeting proceeds. I also wanted to mention to you that just because, and this I guess is my third point, just because I'm saying that you probably don't want your lawyer, and I would argue most of your other service providers on your board of directors, doesn't mean that you don't want your lawyer in the boardroom. It's a very good idea, especially in the early stages of the company, to have your lawyer present at the board meetings. We really feel very strongly that it's the best way for us to understand the vision of the company, to understand what you're going to be doing in the future so that we can be proactive in terms of helping you deal with those issues as opposed to reactive, finding out about an issue when it becomes a problem. So having your lawyer in the boardroom, I think, is a very good idea. And most of the law firms in the Valley, if you ask for an early stage company that they're interested in representing, will agree to attend those board meetings free of charge. So it's definitely worth, when you're interviewing counsel, asking that question and seeing if you can get an assurance that during the early stages, usually the first year or so of the company's life, that board attendance will be free of charge. Let's see, point number 4, I think it's a really good idea to keep your board size small. For a startup company, the board size is frequently, especially a venture-backed company, it'll frequently be 5 directors. 7 is probably okay as you grow, but I think 7's a large board, and I think things can start to get unwieldy the more directors that you have. And I also think it's very important to be careful about giving visitation rights away. Visitors, of course, don't vote at board meetings, but they have the right to fully participate, and they do in those meetings. And so a lot of times having too many visitors in the boardroom, I've actually gone to board meetings that are, where the company is on a round F or G, and, it's hard to get a seat. There are so many people in that boardroom, and it can really cause the board meeting to lose focus, to be dealing with that many people, even though the board is 5 or 7. Don't worry too much about giving up control of the board. If you are going to be venture-backed, you will be giving up control of your board, and you should just get used to it and make sure that the people that are sitting on your board are people that you respect and bring complementary skills and talents to the table. I think Len was mentioning that many people think that Sarbanes-Oxley, although not applicable to private companies, is setting the bar for best practices for companies, and certainly one of the things that you'll see in Sarbanes-Oxley is an emphasis on an independent board. In the past, it wasn't that unusual for a venture-backed company to start off with 2 or 3 inside directors. I think that happens less frequently now. It's more likely that you'll have one founder on the board, and quite frankly, I don't think that's a bad idea. I think it can be very worthwhile if you have the opportunity to negotiate for a few independent seats. So you have some venture capitalists represented on the board, you have a couple of independent seats, and then you have a founder representative. Make sure that your board members are well informed before they get to the board meeting. Make sure, I've gone to many board meetings where the board package arrives 5 minutes after the directors. And it's very hard for people to be strategic when they're just reviewing the information for the first time. I always encourage the companies that I work with, if they are facing issues that they want to discuss at a board meeting, even if there isn't any material to circulate ahead of time, to talk to the board, to make sure that they're aware of what the topics are going to be and have been briefed a little bit on what's going to be discussed at the board meeting, because that does allow the directors to certainly spend time thinking about the issues and just be in a better position to provide advice during the board meeting. Don't let your meetings turn into operating meetings. Your board meetings turn into operating meetings. I've gone to a lot of board meetings where at every single board meeting, every manager comes in and presents. It's an operations committee meeting. It's not a board meeting. Boards are supposed to be strategic. As the CEO of the company, you're responsible for managing your employees. And your board is responsible for managing and working with you. You, as the CEO of the company, are responsible for operations. Your board is responsible for strategy and for working with you on the future, not on what's happening right then. That doesn't mean that you can't have operations people come in and give reports on an as-needed basis, but you have to walk that fine line and understand that you shouldn't be having your operations review in the boardroom. And I guess the only other thing I wanted to say is I think your job as the CEO, if you are the CEO and a board member, is to manage the board's expectations. And it means that you need to be as honest with your board as possible. Their job is to push the company to accomplish as much as it possibly can. Your job is to make sure that the goals that are set are realistic, and to discuss as early and as often in the process as possible any issues or problems that arise that may prevent the company from achieving those goals, so that your board has an early heads up and the ability to work with you on overcoming those issues.
Well, thanks, Diane. Next up is our ringer, Pascal Levinson at Levinson Venture Partners. Pascal felt so strongly about this issue that in November of last year, he wrote a white paper called After the Term Sheet, or How Venture Boards Influence the Success or Failure of Technology Companies. So he is well prepped for this topic. Pascal, you've got the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to build on something that Diane said a moment ago, which is really interesting. She asserted that in reality, the selection process for board composition for venture companies is in effect non-existent. Now, I think that's largely true in practice, but one of the premises of the white paper that I co-authored with Dennis Jaffe last November is that we should all recognize that the venture board can have a significant positive or negative impact on the outcome of the venture-backed company. And so, in fact, I would urge all entrepreneurs to really turn the tables, because the biggest problem, and I think this is root cause for a lot of the issues that have haunted so many venture companies over the last 4 years, is that people have just thought about venture capitalists bringing money, and they haven't thought about what else it is that a venture capitalist really does at a company. And our view, and the whole purpose of the white paper, is to shine a light on how a board can actually impact a venture company. And we have found that it can mean the difference between success or failure. Because if you have a dysfunctional organization, I don't care how good that technology is, at the end of the day, it's not going to matter. Because if people can't sit around a table and help chart strategy and really help move companies forward, especially in an environment, by definition, technology is rapidly changing, and you have windows of opportunity to make the right decisions. And many times, boards will be complacent. People will get into set patterns of behavior. And if you can't break those patterns, you're going to have a significant problem, which is going to compound the operational challenges that the company is naturally going to have. So we felt, and one of the conclusions is, in short, experience trumps money. So you absolutely want to be selecting the right venture capitalists to join your board. Now, what we go into in the white paper is that you want to find, at different times, your companies evolve. And so at different times, different skill sets are required. Our firm only invests in companies when they have initial revenues and initial customers. So we actually don't do seed investing. We don't do A-round investing. Why? Well, our skill set, the skill set of the partners, is best suited to companies that are in this ramp-up of revenue stage. And so we find that we are great partners with the earliest seed investors, the A-round investors. So one thing that we suggest, first of all, is that companies need to assess what the needs that they have on their board, and that gets more complicated by the Sarbanes-Oxley issues, simply because many companies wish to become public companies in the future. And we have some panelists here who have serve on public company boards today. I know that Len does. And one question here is, if you're ever going to make it to be public, at what point do you start behaving that way? You have to change your culture. And there are varying views as to when do independent directors who are not affiliated with venture capitalists, when can they play a constructive role? So we've identified in the white paper, and we spent 11 months researching it, and drew contributions from some of the best-known venture capitalists, some of the larger firms, and also from attorneys, from accountants as well. And the white paper is available freely on our website at levp.com under the news section. So the idea here is we should scrutinize venture boards just the way venture capitalists scrutinize management teams. And I think it's a well-recognized fact that there is self-assessment is sorely lacking on most venture boards. So we identified what are some great characteristics of board members, also what are some common pitfalls that venture boards fall into, and we tried to tie it up with some thoughts as to how you can help diagnose some of your own issues and how you can move forward. I think I'll stop with that for the moment.
Okay, thanks, Pascal. Next up is Len Baker with Sutter Hill.
Thanks very much. It gets harder to be redundant, not to be redundant as you go down the line. I agree with everything that's been said so far. One of our portfolio companies, Dionix, a billion-dollar market cap company with a great record, announced in its quarterly conference call that it expected 2 to 3% of its earnings over the next 6 months to be spent on Sarbanes-Oxley compliance in ways that were on items that would not have been done had the company done it itself, and that they expected to spend 1 to 2% of their earnings going forward permanently on things that they would not have done but for Sarbanes-Oxley compliance. I think that this has direct impacts and indirect impacts. First of all, from a direct point of view, and these are not scientific numbers, but if you just extrapolated this, and by the way, these numbers are consistent with my experience in the public boards that I serve in terms of the cost. If you extrapolate this, you would assume that 1 to 2% of earnings would translate into 1 to 2% subtraction from the market value of the company. The aggregate market value of the stock market in the U.S. is between 15 and 20 trillion dollars. So that would mean that the cost of Sarbanes-Oxley compliance for those things that are not do not create value for the company is somewhere between 300 and 600 billion dollars. That, of course, is more than all of the value that was lost by all the scandal-ridden companies. So that was more than the cost of the lost market capitalization of Enron, MCI, and all of the other scandals, even if you assume that the bubble collapse would have not have reduced their values anyway, and even if you assume that the marketplace would not have corrected some of these abuses anyway. So I think you have to ask the question, what are the direct costs? You have to also ask about the indirect costs. The last public company board meeting I attended, I arrived at 8:15 in the morning, and at 11:45 we finished the portion of the meeting which dealt with compliance rituals, and we started talking about the business. And we talked about the business from 11:45 until 2 p.m. So over 2/3 of the board meeting was spent talking about going through compliance rituals, and 1/3 was spent talking about the business. Not only does this focus the attention of the board off doing what boards really should be doing, which is exercising judgment and not going through mechanical processes, but also it really drives off good businessmen. Good businessmen really don't want to spend their time on boards where you're spending 2/3 of your time on non-essential things. And we're finding in Silicon Valley that it's becoming increasingly hard to recruit good businessmen to be for boards of public companies, particularly smaller and medium-sized public companies. I think that we're advising all of our public portfolio companies to disclose in their quarterly call what the cost of this compliance was, just like Dionix did. I think it's a healthy contribution to the public debate. The point is that the discussion, I think, about corporate governance has really been wrongly focused. It's gotten sort of captured by regulators and lawyers, people who are willing to prevent 20 good things from happening in order to prevent one bad thing from happening. And frankly, I think Stanford Business School has sort of dropped the ball, because the issue is really not regulatory. It's not about compliance. That misses the idea of what boards do. It's really about behavior. It's about good behavior. I mean, the best way to get rid of crabgrass in your lawn is to have a healthy lawn. And the best way to get rid of bad behavior is to have good behavior. So the discussion really should be about how do good boards behave, rather than how do you legislate against abuses. I think I would just make several points about how I think good boards behave. First of all, the board's main job is to hire and fire the CEO. So you need to make sure that there's real accountability. And you need to make sure, as you select a board, that the board is capable of assessing the CEO's performance, is capable of firing the CEO if necessary, and is capable of recruiting a new CEO if necessary. And just because you're a manager of a pot of capital doesn't automatically give you that capability. Second, the board should be collegial. It should operate by consensus. I've been on, I guess, 36 boards over 30 years, been to over 1,000 board meetings, and we've seldom, if ever, have had a split vote on a major decision. Decisions have always been, almost overwhelmingly, always been by consensus. And the board should operate as a group, not as individuals with special individual contributions or special points of view or constituencies. Each board member represents all of the shareholders. And boards should be small. Observers are not a good idea because it destroys collegiality. Boards should be heterogeneous. The ideal board is the CEO, maybe one principal founder, a couple of venture capitalists, and a couple of experienced operating executives. Not all should be out of the same industry or expertise background. Having a board that's composed of people that are deep in the technology of the company is sometimes a bad idea. You have lots of interesting discussions about industry or technology issues, but you're really not discussing the essential strategy issues. Deep industry knowledge and deep technology expertise should not be a requirement necessarily. Boards should add value, not just review, criticize, and approve. And this is really where there's a big, I think, distinction between how healthy boards operate in Silicon Valley and sort of the conventional view of how the sort of conventional corporate governance view of big companies. Silicon Valley is driven by ownership, and most of the board members are going to be significant owners in the company. You want active, interested people. The ideal board member, in my view, is a young general manager of a best practices company who's never been on a board before. The not ideal board member, in my opinion, is a senior luminary, somebody like a cabinet officer, Fortune 100 CEO, famous industry personage. Those kind of people are not likely to dig in a small company board. What kind of activities add value for board members? Recruiting, helping design the organization, helping set up proper incentives, getting involved in strategy, but board members review strategy, they don't create strategy. Getting involved in financing and helping raise money, helping the company with your network and your credibility. It's the CEO's job to make the board effective. It's part of exercising leadership. The The difference between a bureaucratic organization and an entrepreneurial organization is a bureaucratic organization looks at itself through structure, through organizational charts. An entrepreneurial organization looks at itself behaviorally. So it's a much more informal organization. It's the CEO's job to inform and educate the board. I've been on boards where we've got what we call the mushroom treatment. How do you grow mushrooms? Keep them in the dark and cover them with manure. It's the CEO's job to formulate important questions in ways so as to get value from the board, and a good CEO does it very well. And it's the CEO's job to deal with problem members and problem behavior. The board cannot pretend to do the management's job. I was on one board where we had a brilliant board member, a brilliant guy, knowledgeable, experienced general manager, superb in technology, articulate, always had the right answers. But the problem was that the team that had to implement it walked out of the meeting discouraged and bewildered after this guy got done with his brilliant soliloquy, and he was not a good board member. When the board is designing the product, brainstorming the marketing strategy, which it's easy to get sucked into as a venture capitalist, you're in trouble because that's not the board's job. And finally, how important is the board? Well, entrepreneurs are the center of the universe, not venture capitalists. And so a really bad board can kill a company. A routinely bad board can just make a company mildly dysfunctional, except when it fails in its most important job, which is replacing the CEO. A really good board can help somewhat, but its marginal product is not that great compared to the marginal product of a truly great CEO.
Thanks, Len. Next up is our entrepreneur representative, Pavni Diwanji from Mail Frontier. Pavni, how's the board look from your perspective?
Hi. I didn't really prepare a lot because I was expecting to be an interactive panel, but since I'm probably the first CEO representative here, I thought maybe I'll talk through some of my experiences in forming the board and I'll give you some examples of what really happens. So this is my second company. I'll give you a scenario here. We actually self-funded the company for the first few months of its existence, and then went and raised money from two top-tier VCs who were very good quality, who are on our board of directors. We're very excited. The company is now getting off the ground. This is our 6th month, and we've got a lot of money in the bank. Here comes our first board meeting, and we spent the whole board meeting talking about compensation for the 8 consultants that we'd had, which we hadn't paid for a few months, and we wanted to bring them on board full time now. And at the end of that board meeting, I'm thinking, I think it's time to return the money because this isn't working. I don't know why we're not talking about the company's future, the products. Why are we talking about the compensation of the A+ star employees that are proven? I could have just given back the money, except I had my general counsel, the lawyer who had helped us through the financing, on the side, and he says, well, don't react, Pavni, calm down. There are ways out of this. And so then he kind of gave me some advice, and I did what he asked me, which is go talk to other entrepreneur CEOs, make a proper compensation structure chart, and then go back to the board and kind of convince them through some industry metrics what the right answer is. The reason I'm bringing that up is because this incident was an eye-opener to me. One biggest conclusion that I got out of that is that a board cannot function without independent board members who have operational experience. So the first thing I would say in terms of forming the board, sometimes you don't have a choice about it. Like a lot of CEOs inherit a board. And a lot of times you don't have a choice about what investors you bring on board, because if you don't have a choice, you don't have a choice. But what you do have a choice about is making a well-balanced board through independent board members. So choose them carefully and choose people who everyone trusts and can add value, so that it's not a one-sided, quote-unquote, independent board member. So in terms of what we did is we added 2 independent board members over the next few months after this incident. One of them was a public company CEO, and I actually beg to differ at a couple of comments that were made earlier. And he's been great for the company, because when I have an issue, he's a great sounding board for me, because I can he can give me a spot advice on things like, oh, this strategy is going to work, and this strategy you might want to think about, blah, blah, and blah. He doesn't get to devote as much time as my other independent board member, who is effectively at the GM level at a younger company. So I guess I'll go back to my previous point, which is choose a well-balanced team. I view board as my extended team, and it is really important to choose a well-balanced team. Some of the other things I would point out is that from skill set wise and their individual focus wise, it needs to be a well-balanced team. So let me give you an example. My second board meeting. All we talked about was product. I kind of gave a little pep talk saying we don't want to spend the whole board meeting talk about comp. So come the second board meeting, and all we talked about was the product. And I'm going, well, I want to talk about, little more than that. I want to talk about distribution channels. I want to talk about strategy for the company and what marketing campaigns we want to use. And that was a second eye-opener for me, which is, it is really important. People tend to gravitate towards their focal point. And if we have 2 great investors on board, one of them is extremely creative, one of them is very, very product-centric person. Now they have both invaluable insights, but it's not sufficient. So the 2 independent board members, one of the things I was looking for is one of them has extensive marketing background, and it really helps and the other one is more, the public company CEO has done sales all his life and is a great salesman. So I'm just saying, I'm giving you a spectrum of how on skill set wise you can also create a very good balance. Okay, some of the other things I would like to say, and I think one person at least said that you want to operate by consensus. I have to say I beg to disagree. I think that if the board is not asking hard questions and you don't have any conflict, then it's almost too easy. They're not doing their job. So the part of board's responsibility is to stretch the CEO and management's objectives and their imagination. And so part of flip side of it is that some conflict is inevitable, and we should expect it, and the CEO or the chairman of the board needs to manage it very actively. The third thing I would say is you need to build trust. It's like I go back to, it's an extended team, and team cannot function unless there is trust. And so there are various ways you can do that. You need to be always open to their input. One of the techniques that one of the CEOs taught me that I have found to be very useful is never bring cold issues to the board table. So any especially hard decisions, hard issues that we want to tackle, I always make it a point to kind of get offline input from individual board members and get their perspective on it, so that when we go to the table, we can actually have a productive discussion, and we can start with respective viewpoints versus arriving at them. I think someone said you should give up controlling the board. I have one comment for that one, which is either you manage your board or they manage you. So that's the CEO perspective of it, which is that you need to set the agenda and you need to be very clear to communicate what the company's viewpoint and the team's viewpoint are to the board. With that, I'll give the microphone.
Thanks, Pavni. Last up is Kevin Efrazi from Excel, who has the enviable challenge of not being redundant with the first 4 panelists. Kevin, you have it.
Well, before I get started, I want to know my audience a little bit here before I kind of launch into some soliloquy. How many of you guys are interested in this because you're thinking of being prospective entrepreneurs? Okay. How many of you guys are thinking of being prospective board members? Well, okay.
It's the same
I'm sorry.
group.
Board members, but not entrepreneurs on other people's boards. Okay. All right. So, I'll skew it more towards the entrepreneur, but then I'll try to address a little bit about, what you should think of it as a board member. I've been both, and so I've been on the entrepreneur side, and now I have the pleasure of being on the other side, the dark side. So, and I'll try to be brief here. I think the main thing for the entrepreneur is you need to lead. The comment, manage your board or they will manage you, what that really means is think about the way your investors in particular look at your business. And the way we look at your business as an entrepreneur, and it should be the same way you look at your business, by the way, as a startup, which is, what are the key risks to my business? What are and there shouldn't be more than 3, or you shouldn't have gotten funded. But there are probably 3 big risks that you want to take off the table. And I'll try to make this concrete with an example. So the second company I started is a company called Iron Planet. eBay for construction equipment type thing. We can all sort of smile at that idea. It's actually doing pretty well now. But when I got this thing started, I said, well, what are my 3 top priorities? Because we started it from a blank sheet of paper. And at the time, it was, 1, I needed, to recruit the team. It's pretty simple. Recruit the team, launch the product, and then third, I had to take out supply risk, which I saw as sort of the big risk of my business. I had to get a whole bunch of supply on the business to launch. And that enabled signing, there was a major strategic partnership I needed to sign. Those are the 3 things, and that was it. And I said, you know what, I'm just not going to worry about everything else, real estate and branding and all this other stuff. We just can't focus on it. And I got sort of buy-in from my board in individual meetings, and these are the 3 things I need to worry about. And that's all we're going to talk about in the board meetings. It's not going to be until I get to the next stage, I accomplish those 3 objectives, and then you figure out what are the next 3 key risks to get you to the next level. So the way we, as venture capitalists, think about it is, what are the areas of risk we need to take out so that when we raise another round of financing, it's going to be an up round, very simply put. So, and run your board meetings in that way, as opposed to making them some, parade of your operational executives giving a progress update. Because, that way you keep your board members focused. You say, you remember, here are the 3 priorities. Let's keep the conversations to those things. I can't emphasize enough how important that is, because your board members will distract you and work on the issues that are interesting to them if you don't lead them. What to look for in recruiting your board as an entrepreneur? To be honest, a lot of it is people who are willing to do the work and work hard in an early stage. People who are willing to do the work. And all these other things are important, but if you don't have someone who's willing to do the work, none of the other stuff matters, and it's a lot of work. Some other areas of that, make sure their interests are aligned with yours. Don't have strategic investors on your board if you can avoid it. You just don't need the conflict. And it's very difficult for them to wear their board member hat and take off their strategic investor hat. So I would encourage you to not have anybody on your board who isn't strategically aligned. And the problem is you think they can help. They're a relevant partner in your industry, whatever. They shouldn't be on your board, would be my advice. You can't always avoid it, but I would look to avoid it. And then I'd say, after that, it's all the other obvious things. They have a relevant network. And, I agree with the comment about the senior luminary that Leonard made for the most part, except there are some exceptions to the rule where you have a senior luminary who's willing to do the work. And I've been on some boards where they add a tremendous amount of value. But I've also been on others where they don't do squat. Now, as a board member, what would be the advice? I would tend to agree with Leonard with a lot of his comments. The board's job is not to run your company. And so, back to being an entrepreneur, when you're looking for people, be really wary of sometimes people who just came straight from an entrepreneurial background and then are going to sit on your board and haven't really sat on boards before. They will try to run your company for you. They won't know that they're doing it. They think they're helping. They're giving you advice and they're telling you what to do. But it really should be more of a Socratic method. They should ask questions. The ideal board members know what the key issues are, and they ask questions to kind of elicit the response and bring up the issues of the CEO and of the management team. If they're dictating, saying you need to do X, Y, and Z, you eviscerate your management team. They can't make decisions on their own, and they look to you. So that's one thing I said, be Socratic. And then this issue about hiring and firing the CEO is absolutely true. And in some cases, it's also, hiring, firing the founder, which can be very difficult. And that could be a set topic for, an entire topic for the panel. And, I'm not going to go into my opinions on that right now. I'm going to sort of tee it up, and if that's an issue the panel wants to take up, we can talk about. I think I'm just going to stop